Yeah, recordings go.
All right. Today is a very special episode of Theory Night in Canada, and I'm about to say why. At the time of this recording, June 16th, 2024, the War of 1812 started nearly 212 years ago. Actually, 363 days ago. When this episode releases, it will probably be on the anniversary of the start of the war, June 18th, 1812. The War of 1812 is an incredibly important part of Anglo-Canadian identity and a mildly interesting footnote in American history. There,
You reminded me, I had something prepped in my brain where I was going to talk about, hey guys, it's June, which means there's like a major naval to land battle that's happened historically recently that's a big part of American and Canadian culture. I am, of course, talking about something in the War of 1812. It's not D-Day.
I'm, of course, talking about the Battle of New Orleans in 1815.
Well, you just put an intense amount of pressure on Spenny to get the video out.
Yeah.
By June 18th.
Yeah. Listen, there is a quote by the American academic, Dr. Donald R. Hickey. Dr. D.R. Hickey, in other words, on the war. Americans are happy because they think they won, Canadians are happy because they know they won, and the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten about the War of 1812. No disrespect to Dr. Hickey, but as we will reveal over the course of this two-parter series on the War of 1812, the actual academic consensus is a lot more complicated. Now, you two both went to school in Canada. What do you remember about the War of 1812, in brief?
All right, I'll go first. In brief, I have mostly forgotten about it because it's been a minute, and I was not the brightest history student. I remember the name Tecumseh because I thought it was cool, and I also just remember there being some like scattered indigenous battles and stuff like that, and that's honestly about it. I remember that it was apparently huge and very important, but I couldn't really tell you what happened, or at least this is what I wrote down before I did a quick little re-up of info. But like, I know the War of 1812, that's a big name. That's it, dog. That's it.
Oh.
The White House burning. I remember that because we should do it again, I think. It's just like Canadians, Americans, Brits, and some indigenous stuff.
Well,
yeah.
But then it's just kind of like, I couldn't really tell you.
If I remember history correctly, it wasn't called the White House until we burnt it, so you're welcome.
Before that, it was actually first washed.
Yeah.
It was,
no way.
It was partially complete and also washed with pink lime. It was not even white until it was rebuilt.
We should bring that shit back.
Now, Sherry, what do you remember about the War of 1812?
So, I mean, I've always been a Canadian patriot for like ever since I was little. And so I remember being obsessed with the War of 1812. I remember learning about the fake reasons why it started, such as impressment or all the things in quote that the Brits did to the Americans, which was fine for the time. I knew that I remember learning how the president of the time, I believe it was James Madison, was obsessed with taking over Canada for a long, long period and was trying to drum up support in any way he could to take over the country. I know that they burnt down Toronto, and so we burnt down Washington. We had that horrible.
We did that, as we'll cover who burnt down Washington in the next episode.
Oh. No. I know there was... Dang. I remember learning about how, like, 6 people were able to defeat thousands and thousands of Americans in Detroit. And the fallen hero, Sir Isaac Brock, who died valiantly, but, inspired thousands of people later on. Fun fact, in my middle school, one of my friend's great-great-great-grandmothers was supposed to marry Sir Isaac Brock, but unfortunately couldn't because he died valiantly. So she ended up marrying somebody else.
Truly on some incel shit.
And then I remember I think my favorite battle personally, apart from the ones where we destroy the Americans, was the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which is in Niagara Falls, which is that's like the famous lane in Niagara Falls where all the casinos and all the attractions are. But every time I go to Lundy's Lane, all I think about is those poor thousands of Americans and Canadians that were like fighting in the middle of night, not knowing what's going on, accidentally shooting each other on their own side, and then falling into the river. And so that's the last thing I'll say about the War of 1812 that I remember is I remember really hating myself because the War of 1812 obviously had a huge celebration in 2012, and I did not get obsessed with it early enough, so I actually missed out all those reenactions. I'm like, damn it.
Yeah.
Damn. The next one I got is like 2039, which is for World War II, which is not as interesting to me.
Not as interesting, indeed. Now I was hoping.
Honestly, I can't wait to get into. I can't wait to get into more of this stuff because I always read, like I was doing something on the American Civil War at some point, and there are always so many battles that are like, oh, this side shot like 12 of the other side, the other side shot like 38 of this, and like 10,000 people killed themselves by accident.
Yep.
Now, I was hoping... I'm glad, Shrey, that you said what you said, because I was hoping someone would say the heavily propagandized Canadian perspective on the war. The Canadian recollection of the war is a largely retroactively constructed propaganda of the Family Compact, which was the dictatorial ruling party of Ontario from around the end of the War of 1812 to around the crisis of 1837. In their attempt to create a sort of anti-American Canadian identity, they rewrote Canadian history and reframed the War of 1812 as sort of this valiant Canadian militia defeating a far superior American force. And also successfully reframed the war from the Canadian perspective as a naked attempt to re-annex Canada. But as we will cover in the Road to War section, annexing Canada might be like the 5th or 6th thing on the list. Very low priority. Now, that's not to say that the American perspective on the war is correct. The American perspective on the war is also political party propaganda from a one-party state era. It is actually a edited recollection of the war from the perspective of what is now the Democratic Party, who ruled the United States as a one-party state, more or less, from the end of the War of 1812 to around the rise of the Republican Party. The Americans remember the war sort of as an attempt to relitigate the American Revolution, an attempt to re-annex the United States and reverse the freedom gained by the American forefathers during the Revolution. This was also untrue. The British did not want the War of 1812 to happen, and indeed tried to stop it at multiple points, including right before it started. But by the time the British government was clued into what was happening, it was simply too late. In a way, the British perspective on the War of 1812, i.e. that it was a minor theater in the Napoleonic Wars, is probably the most correct. Although, really, what is missing from War of 1812 discourse in popular culture is the indigenous perspective, where the War of 1812 for them is sort of the last chance at an indigenous nation, like a recognized state in America. Truly, nobody won the War of 1812, but certainly Tecumseh's Confederacy lost it more than anyone. But we'll cover first, why did the War of 1812 even happen? The main reason the War of 1812 happened, and is upstream from all of this stuff, is that when the American Revolution ended, it left a lot of questions unanswered. There was also, the War of 1812 also happened because immediately after the American Revolution, the French Revolution happened, and Britain was drawn into a 30-year conflict with France trying to undo the French Revolution. From 1789 to 1815, the British would enter a military cycle of collecting allies in the European continent, attacking France, losing, and then trying again. This cycle severely tapped British manpower, which led to the first issue causing the War of 1812. Naval impressment. This is often cited by Americans as the reason the United States attacked Britain in 1812. So Britain had severely tapped its manpower to fight the Napoleonic Wars and was, by 1811, drafting anyone who was male, had a pulse, and had seen the ocean at some point. The only other requirement besides these three was that they were a British citizen. Notably, it was unclear whether or not Americans were technically British citizens. And this question was an open question from about 1783 until 1795. And in those 12 years, thousands of Americans were drafted into the British armed forces, technically legally. The Americans brought the British to a treaty negotiation called the Jay Treaty of 1795, which established that American citizens are not British citizens. They are mutually exclusive categories. The British agreed to this.
Sorry, how can they, like, so I mentioned impressment before. How can they be considered British citizens when they're literally, like, from a different country? I mean, that's what the whole revolution was. That's what the whole losing the 13 colonies.
Well, is that what the revolution was about? Because when the revolution started, Americans considered themselves British. And their list of grievances was largely founded on the idea that they were British citizens, and thus they were entitled to the same rights as British citizens, which they felt were being contravened. Right? So the British did not... Well, the British recognized anyone born after 1783 as not being a British citizen. Anyone born before the Treaty of Paris would be born in territory recognized as British by the British government, to British parents, right? And considering someone in 1795 who was born after 1783 would be 12 years old, those unambiguously American citizens were not really the focus of this dispute, right? It was more about the people who were Americans before. In 1795, when the Jay Treaty was signed, they would be 12 years old, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is that how it works now? Like, for example, in South Sudan or you know, those countries which are being formed right now, if a person lives there currently, are they just considered South Sudanese, or are they considered still part of Sudan? Do you know?
I think like nowadays, it's less ambiguous. But keep in mind, the American Revolution was basically like the first time two modern states had separated,
right? As
opposed to two medieval countries breaking apart. So this question was not yet resolved, and the Jay Treaty was signed to resolve this question. When America separated from Britain, Americans ceased being British. Was the takeaway, and the British agreed to this treaty. To this treaty clause, but they maintain their right to sort of repossess British deserters, as in British naval personnel who had deserted the British Navy and then joined the American Navy. Now, this doesn't seem like it would be a large category, but the British really stretched this because it was basically impossible at this point to tell if any random American sailor had been a British sailor at some point. So the kidnappings of American sailors continued, this time illegally. Now, between the signing of the Jay Treaty and the year 1807, 9,000 Americans would be kidnapped from American ships in transit by the British, impressed into the British Navy, and then forced to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. This remains sort of a marginal political issue, though. 9,000 people sounds like a lot, but it was the 1800s. The American population was, by this point, in the several million. It was sort of, people were aware of it, but it was sort of considered a peripheral cost of doing business, rather than like a serious issue. It took one...
It's still a huge chunk of the Navy, you know?
9,000 was a lot, but it wasn't just naval personnel. It was also merchant ships and all sorts of other, like, shipping things. It did take one particularly egregious case to actually become a diplomatic incident and a casus belli. So, the year is 1807. The month is February. The British frigate HMS Melampus is anchored off the coast of Hampton Roads, Virginia. As part of the Jay Treaty, the British have the right to dock at American ports, so this is not uncommon. There are British ships up and down the American coast. Hampton Roads, in particular, has tons of British ships. It's a navy yard. And on the Melampus, there are 3 Americans. A white man named John Strawn from Maryland. A black man named Daniel Martin, also from Maryland. And an indigenous man named William Ware. You'll never guess what state of the United States he was from. One night, during an officer's party, the 3 men steal a tender boat and rowed ashore. They're spotted by sentries and fired upon, but they make it uninjured. They then disembark at Hampton Roads, walk to the American Navy office, and enlist in the American Navy. They are then assigned to the USS Chesapeake. When they board the USS Chesapeake, they meet another man. His name is John Ratford. John Ratford is an Englishman from England, an actual British Navy deserter and British citizen. Ratford is not American. He's from London. The British one, not the Canadian one. Now, Ratford had a bad habit of, really a bad hobby, I guess. Whenever he was on leave in Hampton Roads, he would find British officers and make fun of them. He would insult them, shout jibes, claim to be a deserter who had gotten away with it. And during one of his excursions to do this, he mentioned that the Chesapeake had taken on 3 British deserters and there was nothing the British could do about it because they were protected by the American Navy. The British officers inform their superior. Their superior passes it up the line of command all the way to the supreme commander of the British Navy on the American seaboard. He then orders the HMS Leopard to detach from his force and attack the Chesapeake as soon as it is out of port. The Chesapeake then leaves port on a routine patrol and is immediately set upon by the Leopard. The Leopard then pursues the Chesapeake for days until the 2 ships are off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, within sight of land. Then, within sight of the American coast, American people can see this happening. The Leopard fires on the Chesapeake, and the Chesapeake and Leopard are then engaged in combat. The far superior crew of the Leopard manages to get off 4 broadsides directly into the Chesapeake, and the Chesapeake only gets off 1 cannon shot that hits the Leopard. The Leopard loses no men and takes no significant damage, but the Chesapeake loses a mast, and 4 American sailors are killed and 17 are wounded. The Chesapeake then surrenders to the Leopard, and the Leopard's men board the ship. They then review the American crew, find all 4 deserters, Ratford, Martin, Ware, and Strawn, summarily arrest them, charge them, and find them guilty without a trial. The only true Englishman, Ratford is immediately hanged. But due to the Jay Treaty, the British Navy is not sure what to do with Martin, Ware, and Strawn, who have been illegally kidnapped. They are then taken back to the British Navy ship HMS Olympus, where the vice admiral in charge of the region is stationed. The 3 men are court-martialed, and despite being illegally impressed into the Navy, they are still found to have deserted. They are sentenced to 500 lashes each. Now, for the record...
Jesus Christ. It's just a death sentence, is it not?
Yes, it takes roughly 100 lashes to reliably kill an adult man. Basically, they have been sentenced to be, brutally executed in a manner much more violent and painful than Ratford was. But because this happened right off the American coast, the Americans are aware that this has happened. President Thomas Jefferson lodges a formal complaint with the British government demanding restitution and threatening war if the three men are not returned. The British government replies, while the three men were accidentally impressed into the British Navy, they are still deserters legally, and the British cannot return them. However, they do agree to not lash them. So the three men's sentence is commuted. Jefferson says they must be returned or war will occur. The British say, absolutely not, we will not return British deserters to the United States. And Jefferson backs down. Jefferson lets those three Americans stay in British custody, which teaches the British exactly the wrong lesson. The British government in London is now under the impression that the Americans will threaten war and not follow through, even when Americans are being kidnapped and threatened with death.
I do find it funny that this all really was set off by a guy, like, drunk screaming at people.
Yeah.
Like, nothing ever changes. Like, back in the day, a guy would just go to a pub, get drunk, and drop military secrets, and now it's just, like, some guy will be in Discord, get drunk, and drop military secrets. Like,
The third place, eh?
we need more third spaces.
Well, the British government learns the wrong lesson. The two men in charge of Canada are very scared by this incident. Those two men are Isaac Brock and Georges Prévost. Now, Isaac Brock is a British... he's from the new growing British middle class. And he has joined the British Army because his family is deeply, deeply in debt to support their business. Isaac Brock is sending basically all of his money back home to support his brother and parents. And as a result, Brock is not being given the best posts, because the way the British Army works at this point is you have to buy a promotion. As a result, Brock can only afford officer postings in North America, far away from the actual Napoleonic Wars. Nonetheless, Brock's organizational competence leads to his fast-tracking to the top of the ranks in North America, and he is made military governor of Ontario, then Upper Canada, around 1807. Georges Prévost, on the other hand, is from an incredibly rich family. He's not necessarily the best commander, but he does have one asset that basically no other British officers have. He is French, ethnically. His parents are both French. His father is a French-Swiss person, and his mother is a French-Caribbean. One of those...
So you're saying he has a stronger bloodline?
He does have a French bloodline, which is exactly what the British government wants for governor of Quebec. Because since the 7 Years' War, Britain has had to deal with constant separatist riots in Quebec City and Montreal. So they send Prévost to Quebec to take over the province because he is French. So they believe the Quebecers will trust him. And it works. Prévost actually does establish a rapport with local leaders in Quebec and gets them on the side of Britain. Now, Brock and Prévost, they meet up, and they are greatly concerned by the Chesapeake affair. They're unable to convince London that war is actually a realistic threat, so the two men agree to begin building up fortifications in the Quebec-Windsor corridor. So a series of forts and redoubts are built between Sandwich Town, now Windsor, down up to Niagara, then into York, through Kingston, Montreal, and Quebec, are all fortified by the two men. Now, impressment was why the Republican-Democratic Party, or Democratic-Republican Party, which was basically the one-party ruling state of the United States after the War of 1812, it is the reason they cite for why the war happened. But the impressment was relatively minor compared to the much greater issue that happened in the same year, which was the Orders in Council. Now, Orders in Council are basically the British version of executive orders. Or, I think Canada has something like this where the Prime Minister can just do something, Shrey. Do you know what that's called?
Yep. Well, it's only through emergency act or emergency powers, but the prime minister the government through emergency powers can just enact whatever they want for a temporary amount of time.
That's basically what the Orders in Council is. It's like a mechanism where the prime minister and the king can team up and just force something through without consulting parliament. Now, the British have not done this in a very long time, but this is one of those times they did this. Now, 2 years earlier, in 1805, France loses the Battle of Trafalgar to Horatio Nelson, which cements British naval dominance in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. The French Navy is basically destroyed, and the British have total sea lane control. Napoleon renews his commitment to the Navy and begins reconstructing the French Navy, and formally established something called the Continental System, banning all European countries from trading with Britain unless they want to be invaded by France. Britain responds with the Order in Council of 1806, which declares a blockade of all French ports from Brest in Brittany to the Elbe in what is now northern Germany. So that's sort of like a string of land sort of from the English Channel to the North Sea. This first Order in Council forbids anyone from entering these ports, French, neutral, or British. Any ship entering those ports will be seized by the British. France replies with the Berlin Decree, which declares an intention to forbid neutral countries from trading with Britain. Now, this notably includes the United States. France is demanding the United States cease all trade with Britain. The United States is upset by this, of course, because Britain is their main trading partner, but this order is unenforceable. Remember, the French Navy is currently sitting at the bottom of the ocean. It is not going to stop American ships from entering British ports. Britain replies again with the Orders in Council of 1807, which declares a complete blockade of all of continental Europe, except for Sicily and Portugal. Any neutral shipping entering any European port, except for Sicily and Portugal, Britain's only allies at this point, will be seized by the British Navy. Now this actually is a problem, because while the French Navy is unable to stop American merchants from trading with Britain, the British Navy is very easily able to stop any trade with continental Europe, because they are basically the only functioning navy in the world at this point.
That's insane, though. Like, that means you couldn't trade with, what, any of the German states without Britain's approval? Or
could
any
not trade with any German states,
could
not trade with Spain, could not trade with France, could not trade with Scandinavia, Russia, anything. Right? You can understand why this would upset the Americans. So, the initial American reaction was...
Just a complete water-based shutdown.
Yeah. The initial American reaction was, of course, negative. Who is Britain to stop a sovereign nation from trading with Europe? And it was made worse by the fact that the South, which depended entirely on exporting raw resources to Europe, entered a deep economic depression for the next 7 years. Because with the Orders in Council in effect, they could only sell stuff to Britain. And Britain is a much smaller market than all of Europe put together, obviously. This is an issue for Britain. Britain, see, they learned the wrong lesson from the Chesapeake affair, right? They think the Americans are not going to go to war over this. But the British are not counting on the fact that the current political pendulum in the U.S. has swung heavily in favor of Jefferson's Democratic Party. And Jefferson's Democratic Party's voting base is the South. This means that the South is now incentivized to break up the British naval blockade. They are literally economically incentivized to fight the British now to end this blockade as fast as possible. If America does not fight Britain, they are basically allowing themselves to flounder economically. Now, the Orders in Council are taken very negatively in the South for obvious reasons. Obviously, they're taken very negatively in the South due to the economic impact. Not so much in the North, where a growing industrial economy mostly sells its goods back to Americans. the North is not dominated by the Democratic Republican Party, is it instead dominated by the Federalist Party. This Federalist versus Democratic Republican divide in American history is called the first two-party system. Immediately after George Washington left office, these two parties rose up and began divvying up the country. The Federalists are pro-Britain and anti-France, mostly on the grounds that Britain is the world's other industrial economy. They are reliant on good relations with Britain for technological flow into the United States. They need to buy machinery from the United Kingdom to put in American factories. Britain is the only country making these machines, so the Federalists are pro-Britain for this reason. But the Democratic Republicans are just more powerful at this point. If the Federalists had been in charge of the country, it is unlikely the War of 1812 would have ever happened. But the Democratic Republicans are in charge, so the war, as soon as the Orders in Council are signed, is basically an economic inevitability. Now, while impressment was sort of a nothing burger and historically exaggerated, and the Orders in Council is sort of underrated, one issue that is, I think, perfectly rated, as in everyone sort of acknowledges it was a cause of the war, is America's obsession with infinite free real estate. If we rewind the clock to 1754, before the United States even existed, the population of British North America was 2 million. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, because the same area now has a population of 70 million, but that is a lot relative to the other settler colony in the area, which is French North America, New France, which stretches from Louisiana to Quebec. A huge swath of territory that has been left deliberately unsettled. There are only 60,000 white people from New Orleans to Quebec City. This is nothing relative to British North America's 2 million settlers. The Anglo-Americans desperately wanted to settle west of the Appalachians, but they could not due to the French and indigenous nations in the way. So in May of 1754, with the covert approval of the British Foreign Office, a young lieutenant colonel of the British Army named George Washington, who will be better known for other things.
A little indie commander. You might not have heard of him yet, but he'll blow up one day, I guarantee it.
Yeah. Your kids will love this one. But he ignites the 7 Years' War, which, in classic Anglo-French war fashion, is actually 8 years long. So, after the 7 Years' War, the new extension to the American frontier was not given to the American colonists as initially promised. Instead, it was split into the Indian Reserve in the south, or, in the north, folded into the province of Quebec. These two acts of Parliament, the Indian Act of 1763 and Quebec Act of 1774, were two of the main causes of the American Revolution, and two of the main reasons Americans felt betrayed by the British government. They had been promised free land to settle on as homesteaders. Instead, that free land was given to the French and indigenous allies of the British. When the Treaty of Paris was signed, Britain officially recognized these territories, the Indian Reserve and Upper Quebec, as American territory, and these territories became the American Midwest. But British troops did not withdraw troops from the region, claiming that an obscure clause in the Treaty of Paris did not require them to leave. It wasn't until the Jay Treaty of 1795, which we mentioned earlier, clearing up ambiguities in the Treaty of Paris, that the British actually left the Midwest. But while leaving, they left behind a network of spies called the Indian Department, staffed by Indian agents, whose job it was to maintain positive diplomatic relations with the Plains indigenous, while ensuring those same indigenous nations would maintain negative relations with the Americans and prevent the Americans from settling their new western territories. The hope here was if the Americans were slowed in their western expansion, they would not try to attack Canada. Obviously, this did not work, right? Because the Americans did attack Canada, and this is one of the reasons they did. Now, this British covert behavior seriously pissed off the United States, and one American in particular, the governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison.
So before you go into that, I was curious about how about where or how the American nationalism or identity occurred that led them to believe that they were not properly treated after the first two wars, or the first war, 7 Years' War. Like, how did that? Do you know how the identity formed, where they felt that they were not British, like it wasn't part of, they were part of the bigger empire, but they were a separate one who demanded, or who should have gotten more out of the war?
Well, so there's two questions there. When did the Americans stop being British? When did they start believing they were being fairly mistreated? Right? So immediately after the 7 Years' War, they immediately felt unfairly treated. Right? They felt they were deprived of their natural lands they were entitled to. They also did not like the fact that in order to pay off the war debts, Britain was now taxing the United States, which up to this point, well, I guess taxing British North America, which up to this point was exempt from taxation. So they did not like the outcome of the 7 Years' War. It did not go in their favor. Right? So they felt unfairly treated as British subjects. They felt they had been promised by the British government land, and they felt that because they lived outside of the ridings of British Parliament, they were entitled to not pay taxes. So amongst the initial American revolutionaries, the dominant strain of thought was, we can convince George III that Parliament is treating us unfairly, and therefore get a good deal. We can get those lands that we're entitled to, and we can have the taxes abolished. But this idea is kind of delusional. First of all, George III at this point is like a schizophrenic madman. He's not in charge of anything. So convincing George III would be a meaningless exercise. But also, Parliament has no intention of giving in to American demands. So over the course of the war aims of the American revolutionaries switched from getting a better deal to complete and total separation from the British Empire. The American identity as separate from British sort of evolves as a natural course of the political situation in the American Revolution.
But so really it's the taxes which are the issue, because theoretically speaking, the Quebec people, when they got their land and whatnot, it was still part of the British Empire, so it was still helping the empire as a whole. But the Americans didn't feel that, or didn't feel that they were appropriately compensated.
Yeah, basically. They felt they were not compensated, and then they felt they were being taxed despite gaining nothing. So...
Okay.
So the British and the Americans have very different visions for the American Midwest. The British want a non-white Midwest, living a traditional indigenous lifestyle so that they can build an economic relationship with. The British want this because they have done this before in the Hudson's Bay region. For decades, they have successfully prevented white settlement of Manitoba and Northern Ontario, to the benefit of the Cree, who they who they use to sort of get furs from the Canadian interior. The British want this economic relationship to continue to exist in the American Midwest as well. The Americans, on the other hand, want to open the Midwest to settlement, with or without the indigenous people still on it. Preferably with. Thomas Jefferson will write to William Henry Harrison the following letter. Our system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians, to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them by everything just and liberal, which we can do for them with the bounds of reason. When they withdraw themselves to the culture of a small piece of land, they will perceive how useless to them are the extensive forests, and will be willing to pair them off in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families. So, basically, the American strategy is to turn these hunter-gatherer, pastoralist, and early agriculturalist plains indigenous into American farmers, American subjects, and American citizens. The idea here is if the indigenous population is concentrated and Americanized, they will part with their massive tracts of land willingly. They will be willing to sell it to the government. The job of enacting this goal is given to the young, hotshot governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison. And his explicit instructions are, achieve this goal peacefully, and if impossible, drive the savages across the Mississippi.
So is that do this peacefully, and if not, do it violently?
Yes.
More or less, right?
So Harrison arrives in Vincennes, Indiana, sets up shop, and prepares to annex the indigenous territories still not under American control. His opposite number is a pair of brothers, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, of the Panther clan of the Shawnee Nation. These two men are the exact people you do not want to be doing this struggle with. They were both raised by their older brother, Chisakau, a warrior who died fighting against American independence during the Revolutionary War. Chisakau imbued in his brothers a strong sense that the Americans are the enemies of the indigenous people. When Chisakau died in the war, his Tenskwatawa, the youngest brother, lapsed into alcoholism and philandering. In 1805, Tenskwatawa claimed to be visited by the Great Spirit, the creator god of Shawnee mythology, who told him to unite the tribes of the plains against America, and imparted him with a sacred mission to, quote, drive whites back into the sea. His religious preaching attracted a massive following and birthed a religious movement preaching that all land in North America was held in common by all indigenous people, and no part of it could be ceded or sold without the unanimous permission of the entire indigenous race. This is a serious problem for William Henry Harrison, who is trying to buy land from the indigenous people, right? If he needs the permission of absolutely every single person in the territory, it is never going to happen. Frustrated by Tenskwatawa's preaching and growing religious influence, Harrison distributes a letter to the tribes in the region. Quote, "Who is this pretended prophet who dares to speak in the name of the great Creator, the Almighty God? Examine him. Demand of him some proof, some miracles. If he really is a prophet, ask him to cause the sun to stand still and the moon to alter its course." Big mistake. You see, that year, the Midwest is scheduled to have a total solar eclipse. In response, Tenskwatawa proclaims to his followers, "I will darken the sun on 11:32 a.m. of June 16th, 1806.
There's no way he was that specific.
The exact time to the minute that an eclipse passes over Illinois. When this happens, his movement is significantly strengthened. Thousands of warriors flock to Tenskwatawa's banner.
That's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I'm with him, man. I'm with him. You know?
Yeah.
Someone says they're blotting out the sun gets blotted out. I'm like, everything he says is right. You know?
Yeah.
Now, at this time, did he have like reliable methods of predicting eclipses, or what was he just like? Was he just genuinely divinely inspired?
No. So historians debate intensely how Tenskwatawa knew this. Now, obviously, you could say, oh well, the great creator told him the time and date, right? The thing is, determining when an eclipse would occur was like easy to do by this point. Like, they had the knowledge to do it. They knew when eclipses would occur and where. The most common consensus is that the British Indian Department, the Indian agents who were these like spies implanted around the Midwest, gave Tenskwatawa one of the almanacs that included the list of eclipses that would strike the region, right? So Tenskwatawa could use those almanacs to be like, oh, Harrison has challenged me to blot out the sun. Easy. When's the next eclipse, right?
I don't think that happened. I think he said he was going to do it, and I think he did it.
Listen, the academic consensus is still out on how exactly he did this. So if you want to say the great creator actually told him the time and date, I'm sure you can find some academics who'd agree with you.
Yeah. You have as good a claim as anyone.
Yeah, exactly. There's no proof the British Indian agents actually gave him an almanac. No almanac has ever been found, right? So it could have been the great creator, right? Unfortunately, Tenskwatawa, while smart enough to predict the eclipse, makes a very critical mistake in demanding that his followers stick to traditional modes of warfare and reject concepts like firearms. Not exactly an effective way to fight a modern army, right?
They brought a knife to a gunfight.
They do indeed bring a knife to a gunfight, which will bite them in the ass later. Now, while Tenskwatawa was the religious leader of this growing movement, his brother Tecumseh quickly emerged as its secular leader. Tecumseh has proven himself since age 12 to be an incredibly talented warrior and gifted commander. He's been leading border skirmish raids on white settlements in Indiana for years, and he uses his brother's movement to build sort of a political movement around the idea of a united indigenous nation. While that is happening, in 1808, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Harrison gathers 8,000 representatives from local tribes that have not yet joined Tenskwatawa's religious movement. He wants to buy land from them totaling 3 million acres. Now, the British Indian agents have contacted these tribes and told them, this land is worth $2 an acre. Do not sell it for anything less than $2 an acre under any circumstances. The Americans are scamming you. But Harrison, nonetheless, because he is a talented politician and diplomat, manages to convince the tribes that it is not the United States that is lying, it is the British. If they do not sell their land for his offering price, the land will never be sold. So over the course of a 5-day negotiation, Harrison makes the following pledge. Quote, "This is the first request your father, the president, has ever made of you. It will be the last. He wants no more of your land." In the end, Harrison convinces the Miami tribe to sell their tract for a measly $700 yearly pension for the next 50 years. That, by far, is the largest share of the sale. In total, Harrison manages to purchase all 3 million acres for $50,000. Remember, the British have assessed this land at $6 million, $2 an acre. William Henry Harrison has just purchased it for $50,000.
Jesus Christ.
He sends a letter back to Washington, D.C. The Harrison purchase makes him an immediate political celebrity in the Democratic-Republican Party. Everyone loves this hotshot Harrison, and settlers begin to flock to Indiana to buy this land.
I remember being told all through school that, like, the dealings were pretty damn imbalanced and all of that, but I never actually got the numbers. That's pretty brutal. And I also love how it's like, how do you become, like, a big political up-and-comer? Is just, like, scam the natives, you know? Just scam.
Yeah.
Nothing ever changes.
The half of it. In British Columbia, it's really bad.
Yeah.
But that's another episode.
So there's one problem here. So, while the Miami are the sedentary inhabitants of this territory, as in they live in these pastoralist communities in that area, the Shawnee also use those lands as hunting grounds. Now, the Shawnee are nomadic. They don't have a specific territory they live in. They sort of range north and south through the plains. The Shawnee, remember, are the tribe of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. And when they hear about this land sale, they are enraged. They claim that as this is their ancestral hunting ground, they have as much a claim to it as the Miami. So, Harrison invites them to Vincennes, the capital of the Indiana Territory, to negotiate the Shawnee claim to the area. Harrison's plan is he will bring Tecumseh to Vincennes and try to force the indigenous leader to produce a title to the land. Since the Shawnee are nomadic, they have no such recognized title by any treaty, so he can sort of debate lord them into giving up. That's the idea. Tecumseh, on the other hand, has a different plan. Tecumseh is going to go to Vincennes, and he is not going to negotiate. He is going to go there to cause problems. That's it.
Hero.
So, Tecumseh arrives. He's on the lawn of the Vincennes governor's mansion, where Harrison lives, and Harrison invites him inside. Tecumseh says, "Houses are for white men. Indians hold their meetings in the open air," and refuses to enter the building. Harrison then has to have the furniture for the negotiation moved outside. Once all the seating is set up over the next hour, Harrison invites Tecumseh to sit next to him, saying, "Your father requests your presence beside him." Now, this line is not necessarily unusual. Both the British and the Americans have taken an incredibly paternalistic tone with indigenous people up to this point. The president is often referred to as the father of the people in American negotiations, and King George III is usually referred to as the father of the people in British negotiations. Tecumseh replies, "My father, the Great Spirit is my father, the earth is my mother, and on her bosom I will recline." He then knocks his chair over and sits on the ground. Harrison then needs to have the chairs removed so there is enough room for Tecumseh's party to sit on the ground. Tecumseh is then invited to speak to the crowd of dignitaries, which includes representatives from all the regional tribes. The plan is Tecumseh will give a short 10-minute speech to open negotiations. Tecumseh launches into a 3-hour tirade in Shawnee. The speech is interrupted so they can bring in translators to translate Shawnee into the various languages of the conference. When the speech proceeds for the next 3 hours, it includes the following warning. Tecumseh himself will kill any man who sells or buys indigenous land, starting with the traders who sell. A startled chief of the Potawatomi, who have sold their land along with the Miami, gets up and leaves in a panic. Some of Tecumseh's entourage follows the chief, and the chief is never seen again. The effect on the indigenous in the crowd is recorded as following by a white observer. Quote, "The effect of his bitter, burning words was so great that the whole 300 Indians could hardly refrain from springing to their feet. Their eyes flashed with passion, and even the most aged, many of whom were smoking, evinced the greatest excitement and turned against us. Inviting Tecumseh has been a grave mistake." Harrison then takes the stand and gives a speech ridiculing the concept of a united indigenous nation, as Tecumseh envisions, especially one led by the nomadic Shawnee. How can you have a nation without a city or a capital? Tecumseh and his men fly into a rage at the mention of the Shawnee. They spring to their feet, grab their weapons, and charge the podium. The Indiana militia charges to meet them and draws their guns. Tecumseh then withdraws with his men, and the negotiations close before they even begin. The opening remarks are the only thing that happens.
Now I remember why I came out of this, looking at Tecumseh and being like, that guy, kind of rocked.
Yeah. He was a cool guy. So over the next 2 years, the matter kind of remains unresolved. And Tecumseh establishes a confederacy. Tecumseh's Confederacy. He moves through the Midwest, visiting tribe after tribe, folding them into this growing country. And for the first time, the Shawnee settle down and actually build towns and villages. The chiefs allied to Tecumseh are rewarded. Their numbers swell, and Tecumseh brings them into his war councils. Chiefs that reject Tecumseh's alliance or even ally with the United States quickly end up dead. And if they don't, many of their warriors defect to the Confederacy. The Confederacy grows to cover basically all land between northern Missouri and the Great Lakes. This new country approaches the British. They ask the British Indian Department to call a conference with the chief Indian agent in Amherstburg, now a suburb of Windsor, to negotiate a British alliance with the Confederacy. So the chief Indian agent is a man named Matthew Elliott. Elliott is a 70-something-year-old man who has multiple wives, all of whom are indigenous women. Like all Indian agents, this is actually fairly common. The Indian agents are generally integrated into indigenous society. They are married to indigenous women. They have indigenous children. When they retire, their half white, half indigenous children usually take over the role. They are genuine allies of these people. So Elliot arrives cheerfully, hoping that, the Confederacy is here to proclaim support for the British geopolitical interests in the region. To his dismay, he realizes the Indian Department has done its job too well. the Confederacy is asking the British to declare war on the United States so that the Confederacy can retake land lost. A tense negotiation ensues, and Elliot manages to talk down the Confederacy, and the Confederate representatives leave disappointed. But he reaffirms British support of indigenous independence. He does manage to convince them that Britain is unable to currently fight America head-on. They are too busy in Europe doing something else. That something else is the Napoleonic Wars. Now, in 1811, the land situation is still not cleared up. Harrison has made this blockbuster purchase, but he cannot actually access the territory. Anytime he tries to settle it, Tecumseh's Confederacy drives them out. So, in a last-ditch attempt at a peaceful conclusion, he once again invites Tecumseh to Vincennes to negotiate. Once again, Tecumseh shows up with no intention to negotiate. He arrives with 170 delegates from the various nations of the Confederacy. Tecumseh meets Harrison, mocks him relentlessly for failing to seize the territory that he purchased, points out the hypocrisy of Harrison's objection to indigenous unification, saying, "After all, didn't your people unite a white nation out of the disparate states in the East just a few decades ago?" During one incident of negotiation, Tecumseh asked Harrison to sit with him on a bench as his equal. Throughout the conversation, he deflects Harrison's comments and slowly edges Harrison to the edge of the bench, pushing him to the side over and over again. When Harrison finally objects, Tecumseh laughs and says, "Now you see how we have felt for the last 100 years.
I love this fucker. I love this fucker more than ever.
Harrison is frustrated and ejects Tecumseh from the grounds of the Indiana Territory. Tecumseh leaves peacefully, thanks Harrison for his hospitality, and while Harrison is frustrated, he writes in his diary, quote, "Tecumseh is one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. If it were not for these United States, he would surely found an empire that would rival the glory of Mexico or Peru." So, Harrison respects Tecumseh, but damn is he making his job hard as hell. So with the final rounds of negotiation failing, Harrison realizes he has no choice but to follow the second option in his orders. If he cannot drive the Indians out peacefully, he will have to do it by force. Harrison sends spies into the Confederacy and times his attack on the Confederacy for when Tecumseh will be gone. He correctly assesses that if Tecumseh is in the Confederate capital when he attacks, he will probably lose. So, when he receives word that Tecumseh is leaving the capital of Prophetstown on a journey south, he begins his advance. Now, Tecumseh is leaving because he hopes to recruit southern tribes, like the Creek and the Osage, into the Confederacy. His idea is he is going to unite every tribe from the Gulf of Mexico to Lake Superior to create sort of this mega nation that will be strong enough to fight the Americans. He will fail in his goal to get the southern tribes on his side. Meanwhile, Harrison assembles a militia force of 700 infantry, 90 cavalry, and 250 regular army troops. His 790 infantry and cavalry are militia, untrained, just sort of random civilians who own guns who are willing to sign up. He and his men march up the Wabash River with the intention of reaching the capital city of the Confederacy, Prophetstown, and destroying it. When Tenskwatawa, who is still in Prophetstown, hears about Harrison's advance, he desperately tries to reopen negotiations to negotiate an evacuation from the purchased territory. By this point, though, it is too late, and Harrison refuses to negotiate. On November 6, 1811, Harrison's men encamp on a hill overlooking Prophetstown along the Tippecanoe River. Tenskwatawa, realizing that Harrison is not going to leave, launches a surprise attack in the night, and a fierce battle ensues. Harrison barely ekes out a win, taking more losses than the attacking indigenous troops, including the commander of his cavalry unit, who dies in a suicidal, unplanned charge. Nonetheless, the Confederate warriors retreat, and Prophetstown is evacuated. The next day, Harrison marches into the city and burns it to the ground, scattering its inhabitants, destroying it. Within the city, they find 2 muskets. Stamped on the muskets are manufacturing seals of the Lancaster Musket Manufactory in Great Britain. Indisputable proof, in the eyes of Harrison and the Democratic Republican Party, that not only is Britain spying on the Americans and riling up the indigenous people, they are actively funding and arming them. Indisputable proof in Harrison's eyes that Tecumseh's Confederacy is just a puppet of British imperialism. Once word of Harrison's victory reaches the American public, Harrison immediately becomes not just a political hero within his party, but a national hero. Tippecanoe is held up as this massive victory, even though it was barely a win against a small number of enemies, and it riles up anti-British sentiment. It is becoming clear that once again, the British are stopping the Americans from settling the Midwest. What was the point of the American Revolution if the British are just going to do the same thing again? Give the lands to the indigenous people when it rightfully belongs to the white Americans.
How did the Confederacy not collapse at this point? Like, Tecumseh just lost his capital.
Well, it was just when Tecumseh returned, Tenskwatawa was still alive. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh were sort of the political force holding the Confederacy together. When Prophetstown was destroyed, they just moved their capital somewhere else.
Interesting. Yeah, because the capital's gone.
The idea behind destroying Prophetstown was that it would destroy the Confederacy, but really, Tecumseh managed to spin it into a, look, we have no choice but to fight the Americans, or they're just going to keep attacking us, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Now, the Canadian answer of why the War of 1812 happened was to annex Canada. There is certainly evidence of a faction of Americans within the Democratic Republican Party that wanted to annex Canada. These were called the Warhawks. They were 3 people. Now, maybe I'm biased as a resident of Canada who's glad that I don't live in the United States, but these 3 guys, not very nice people. These 3 men are Henry Clay, sort of the Hillary Clinton of the 19th century.
It's same initials, right? That makes sense.
Henry Clay was a mildly progressive, center-left liberal in the Democratic Republican Party who nonetheless was obsessed with war and American imperialism. He also repeatedly tried to run for president and kept losing. John C. Calhoun was the second of the Warhawks. Anyone with a familiarity of 19th century American history will immediately recognize John C. Calhoun as one of the worst people to ever live. The intellectual heart of the anti-abolition movement, John C. Calhoun was a talented academic who wrote books about why slavery was actually good and should be expanded to include the whole country. Basically, some people are casual racists, some people are competitive racists. John C. Calhoun, quite possibly history's only professional racist.
Holy shit. There's I love how every now and then you can do a little bit of digging and find someone that's has the worst opinion. And then my favorite part about these is every now and then, if you do even more digging, you'll read some of the shit you're saying. And for a brief second through their wordplay, they'll manage to make you think maybe he's onto something, and then you close the book and you're like, no, not a damn thing was working in this guy's head.
The third Warhawk is a man named Felix Grundy. He is an attorney and a prominent politician in the Democratic Republicans, and while he, unlike Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, he will not accomplish anything personally like they will, Felix Grundy is the intellectual father of Manifest Destiny, which you have definitely heard of, and the political mentor of James K. Polk, the Manifest Destiny president, whose nickname was the Great Annexer because of how much territory he stole from Mexico. Now, the Warhawks were primarily concerned with infinite American expansion as a solution to whatever those three men thought were America's internal issues. Calhoun saw the annexation of Canada and the Midwest as an opportunity to create new slave states. Calhoun was concerned that while slavery was strong now, it would grow progressively weaker as new states were added to the Union. What he wanted was to add as many new territories as possible while the Democratic Republicans were still in charge, because then they could make those new territories into slave territories, thus securing the eternal existence of slavery. Henry Clay was pro-war because he saw it as a way to quickly end the Depression of 1807. Felix Grundy wanted to annex Canada because he wanted more territory for the United States for really no reason other than he wanted the United States to be as big as possible. He was not a slavery diehard like...
Just love of the game.
Yeah, he was not a slavery diehard like Calhoun. He was just obsessed with the idea that America was destined to own all of the Americas.
I'm sorry, but like in 1790, if I remember correctly, was it 1792 the Ontario banned slavery officially?
Yeah.
And I believe Quebec followed suit like instantly right after. Where were those slave states going to be coming from? These were all non-slave states.
Well, the idea was slave owners would move to these new territories, bring slaves with them, and build plantations.
To the north?
Like, when Ontario was annexed, it was not going to keep its British institutions, right? They were going to be replaced with American ones.
Yeah, but there was already not that many plantations up north. All the plantations were all south because of weather. What was Calhoun on?
Calhoun was, first of all, a fucking crazy person, right? I mean, this is like... Pull up a picture of James C. Calhoun or John C. Calhoun and you'll see what I mean. But also, honestly... I don't know why he thought Canada would be a good slave state, but it was what he thought would happen. Now, James
Madison...
Madison...
It doesn't make any sense. There's no plantations here.
Maybe he thought there was something he could grow here. Or at the very least, they could entrench Democratic Republicans in the administration here and make it pro-Southern. James Madison, the president at the time, while not technically a war hawk, was certainly very sympathetic, which is the only reason the annexing Canada as cause of the war really has any water whatsoever. But the thing is, annexing Canada as sort of this dream of American imperialism was very much an elite idea, not a popular one. Most Americans did not care about Canada. Just at all. Like, annexing Canada was not on their radar. The main party line of the Democratic Republicans regarding Canada, despite Madison's sympathy to the Warhawks and the Warhawks themselves, was that Canada was to be taken hostage and exchanged back to Britain in return for a termination of Tecumseh's Confederacy. Basically, the British would destroy the Indian Department in exchange for giving Canada back. Now, British preparations / why didn't they do something to stop this? Britain did not want a war with the United States, despite the American mythologizing about the war retroactively. While the Indian Department and its Indian agents were supposed to rile up the indigenous peoples against America, they were not supposed to do so in a way that would actually draw Britain into a war. Unknown to London, the Indian Department was way too good at its job, and most of its employees actively despised the United States and wanted it destroyed. Most of its agents were thoroughly integrated into the tribes throughout the region. Many of them were of mixed ancestry of a previous generation Indian agent. And many Indian agents who were not mixed were American loyalists who had a deep ideological hatred of the American Republic and wanted it gone. London really was just not aware of what was happening in North America at the hands of its own intelligence service. The Napoleonic Wars were going on, and the British ambassador to the United States was certainly not helping Britain's awareness of the situation. The British ambassador in 1811 was a man named Sir Augustus John Foster, a Nepo baby who was not good at his job. When the American government repeatedly complained to him about British foreign policy towards the United States, the Orders in Council, naval impressment, support for Tecumseh's Confederacy, he pledged to forward those complaints to London, but never did. fearing that if he did, he would be fired and replaced with someone better at negotiating. He did not want to be pulled out of the United States because he kept being invited to high society parties. He just loved going to balls and hanging out with the American, aristocracy too much.
This guy's an absolute hero in my books. Literally caused this whole thing just because he didn't want to work anymore, you know?
A quiet quitting hero, one would say.
He just sat there and was like, I don't want to do my job. I just want to party. I just want to have fun. And then pretty much just directly caused a very notable war. Just chilling.
Yeah. Eventually the American government got tired of complaining to Foster and started getting their embassy in London to complain directly to the Prime Minister. By this point, though, it was kind of too late. When the Prime Minister heard the Americans were actually about to attack Canada, a mad dash occurred in Parliament to undo everything. An exemption was added to the Orders in Council, allowing American shipping to Europe. The Indian Department was ordered to withdraw from the Midwest, and impressment was ended permanently. American citizens, whether they were deserters or not, were now exempt from impressment. The issue is, all of this stuff happened on June 16th, 1812, around the time the British government heard about all of this for the first time. And on June 18th, 1812, the United States delivers a declaration of war to Augustus Foster, and he is kicked out of Washington, D.C. While London isn't aware, Canada certainly is, right? Prévost and Brock are aware that the Americans are going to attack Canada because the British government is not stopping this antagonistic behavior. They have, as I said before, strengthened fortifications across the Quebec-Windsor corridor. Brock has used his powers as military governor in the intervening time to rewrite laws in Ontario single-handedly, bypassing the Upper Canadian legislature. He has enhanced training techniques and expanded acceptable volunteer quality. Unfortunately, Brock butts heads with the Ontario legislature. While Prévost has no problems funding fortifications and militia expansion in Quebec, while the Quebecers are not fans of Britain, they certainly do not like the Americans a lot more. The Ontario legislature is absolutely dominated by American sympathizers, to Brock's frustration. Why? Well, because Ontario's population, on the day war is declared, is 60% American. Recent migrants from America who have moved to Ontario after the Revolution, not because they politically oppose the American government, but because Ontario has no taxes at all. No sales tax, no income tax, no property tax. All government expenditure is done through grants directly from London. Also, Ontario is full of incredibly fertile land that is currently not occupied by white settlers. So these Americans are moving here because there's fertile land and no taxes, and Ontario is allied to Tecumseh's Confederacy. So Tecumseh is not harassing white settlers in Ontario. It's the perfect place to move, right? 60% of Ontario's population is American. Only 20% of Ontario's population are loyalists, and the remaining 20% are Indigenous or French, who are passively pro-British but don't really care that much about the fate of the British Empire. Brock is savvy enough, of course, to recognize the utility the Indigenous people in Ontario represent, and on the eve of the war, makes contacts with the Indian Department. He is, at this point, a friend and ally of Matthew Elliott and his agents. So, when he realizes war is going to be declared, on June 16th, he sends a coded letter to Robert Dixon. Robert Dixon is a towering, red-headed, thick-set Irish loyalist with an Indigenous wife and a personal friend of Tecumseh. Brock sends a letter to Dixon asking him the disposition of Indigenous troops in the area and whether or not Tecumseh will join the British if the Americans declare war. The letter is dispatched, but unfortunately, war is declared before it arrives in Dixon's hands.